doing a presentation on sound design in 2001: A Space Odyssey. So what exactly is sound design? Well, according to looking at movies, author Barsom has declared it to be the art of creating sound for a film. So some of the ways that we experience this are through the dialogue, how articulate their words are, if it's muffled, if it's something in his head, you can hear kind of an underwater effect potentially, or a lot of delays on the vocals. We also hear the room. So when we enter a different room, if it's a big ceiling, it's all loud, and if it's a small, tiny closet, it sounds very condensed. And another thing that we hear are the objects, the moving around. So you can hear I'll move a reel of tape. It's a very subtle sound effect, but just that we can tell exactly what they're moving and create these little nuances in the film that convince the viewer. So, also I'd like to focus on ambient sound. Now, what ambient sound is, again from the book, the definition states what emanates from the ambience or background of the setting or environment being filmed is either recorded during production or added during post-production. So some of the sounds are, in terms of 2001, which we'll get to in a second, are the computer beeps, the keyboard clicks that you'll hear in the background. You'll hear the machines running, stuff like that. You're going to really hear just a lot of the little nuances, as well as the hiss of the room, whether we hear the lights making noise or the air conditioning unit. So a lot of this background noise is very important to create a realistic viewer experience. So our first example we're going to go to is room noise. We'll check out this link. Now, as we'll hear it, I want you to listen for the difference between when they are in this room to when they enter the pod.
Dave? Well, I've been getting some interference on D channel. We'll have a look at it.
Stop pod rotation, please, Al.
Rotate the pod, please, Hal. Rotate the pod, please, Hal.
So as you can hear, we go from a very loud, active room like this to an isolated...
What do you think?
To an isolated little booth. Now, this creates tension. When we're coming from this kind of room, we know it's active, we know there's things going on, and specifically in the context of the movie, we know that Hal is in there. However, when we move to this scene, the isolation is supposed to identify that Hal can't hear what they're saying. And another is just to convince the viewer that they are in a different room. Now, if they were to keep the same sound effect over here, while it might work, this just creates a more pleasant viewing experience. Okay, so moving on, we're going to talk about absolute silence. And as I mentioned earlier, tension is huge to creating an incredible viewer experience. So, in this scene, we're going to be viewing Frank, his untimely passing. Just give this a moment to load the ad. Okay. So in this scene, we have Frank going out to fix the little unit. However, Hal likes to play a little trick, not so little, a kind of a serious move, and traps Hal out in space. And so what Kubrick had to do was find out what exactly does space sound like. And as we understand today, it is a vacuum out there, thus having no sound at all. So we're going to go from here, which is the sound of the inside of the pod, to absolute silence. We'll hear that again. Now what this effect does is pull the rug from under our feet. At first we're expecting to continue to hear this kind of background noise. It's very calming, very lulling. But the second this absolute silence happens, there's a new emotion created. And we are terrified of the void. Moving on. I'd like to get to examples of Foley. Now what Foley is are the sound effects, like I mentioned earlier, moving the tape. They wouldn't be able to use that sound. They'd want to make a more amplified, detailed version of this tape moving. So, in the example here, we already saw it a little bit ago. And while it's a very small moment, it's so important to hear this throughout the film. Just one moment. Okay. So what I want you to listen for here is the stereo effect of all the switches that he is about to hit. Now listen as it pans across the sound field. Did you hear that? Go from left to right. And there we are, like before, into a new room, all signified by a very visual and sonic representation of exiting. So little nuances like this I believe to be very important to the experience, because ultimately we want to be convinced that we're in that pod. We're looking at them, we're experiencing the terror that they're feeling. And little moments like this really is what makes the difference from a good film to a great film. So, in conclusion, sound design is one of the most important aspects of a film. Now, there are many important aspects, but to be able to sonically be there is a huge difference. It's one of the differences that differs films as an art between photography and music, or any kind of sound, or any type of visual representation. It's that marriage between the two that makes a really beautiful product. So, what the viewer can expect sonically to move through the scenes, hearing that room noise, that artificial tension that we heard earlier, and the absolute silence, and being able to have a detailed world to live in by those little nuances that we hear in between. Thank you so much for listening to the presentation. I hope you guys have a good night.